Kira Nethval woke to the sound of her daughter singing in the kitchen, a melody that combined traditional Altairian harmonics with the cheerful chaos of human children's songs that Zara had learned from her playmates in New Haven. The hybrid music had become the soundtrack of their exile, representing everything beautiful and heartbreaking about raising an Altairian child among humans on a world that neither species had originally called home. "Morning, little star," Kira called, using the endearment that connected them to the home they had lost when cosmic radiation storms had made Altair Prime uninhabitable. Zara's laugh in response carried the crystalline quality that marked all Altairian voices, though her 6-year-old enthusiasm gave it notes that would have scandalized the formal social structures of their original world. New Haven stretched beyond their small apartment window, a frontier settlement where human colonists and a handful of Altairian refugee families attempted to build lives among the red stone formations and alien vegetation of Kepler 438b. The view reminded Kira daily that they were survivors in an environment that challenged everything she thought she understood about raising a child whose development followed biological patterns that human medical facilities were not equipped to support. "Mom," Zara called from the kitchen, her voice carrying a note that made Kira's maternal instincts sharpen to attention. "Something feels weird." Kira joined her daughter at their small breakfast table, noting how Zara's luminescent skin seemed brighter than usual, pulsing with patterns that indicated either excitement or distress. Altairian children's emotional states were always visible to anyone who understood their physiology, though 6 months in New Haven had taught Kira that human neighbors often misinterpreted the light patterns as merely decorative rather than communicative. "Weird how, little star?" "My back itches," Zara said, reaching over her shoulder to scratch at something Kira couldn't see. "It's been itching all night, but not like when I have dry skin. It itches like when my teeth were growing in, except it's on my back." Kira felt cold certainty settle in her chest as she recognized the description. Altairian children sometimes experienced growth sensations when their bone structure developed, but itching sensations in the back were not part of normal childhood development according to anything she had learned from her own mother or the community elders who had not survived the evacuation from their dying world. "Let me see," she said, moving to examine Zara's back with hands that trembled despite her efforts to appear calm. What Kira discovered made her heart stop. 2 small protrusions were emerging from Zara's shoulder blades, barely visible beneath her luminescent skin but unmistakably present as raised areas that pulsed with their own internal rhythm. The growths appeared to be organic extensions of bone and tissue, following patterns that shouldn't exist according to everything Kira understood about Altairian physiology. "Mom." Zara's voice carried concern as she sensed her mother's distress through the empathic connections that linked Altairian families. "What's wrong? Is it something bad?" Kira stared at the growths, her mind racing through possibilities that all led to the same terrifying conclusion. The protrusions resembled the preliminary stages of a condition she had heard whispered about in hushed conversations among adults, a mutation that traditional Altairian society considered evidence of genetic corruption that marked individuals as fundamentally flawed. "It's..." Kira began, then realized she had no words for what she was seeing. Altairian cultural conditioning had taught her to fear exactly these kinds of physical aberrations, to view them as shameful marks of biological instability that threatened the purity of their species. "Mom, you're scaring me," Zara said, her luminescence shifting to patterns that indicated growing anxiety. "What's growing on my back? Is it going to hurt?" Kira pulled Zara into her arms, careful to avoid the sensitive areas around the protrusions, and held her daughter while trying to process implications that challenged everything she thought she understood about genetics, mutation, and what it meant to be Altairian in exile. "I don't know, little star," she admitted with honesty that felt like failure. "I need to ask for help to understand what's happening to you." The rest of the morning passed in a haze of desperate research and increasingly frantic attempts to contact the few other Altairian adults in New Haven's refugee community. Kira's calls were met with responses that ranged from concerned sympathy to barely concealed horror when she described Zara's symptoms. The older survivors shared her cultural conditioning about mutations, their reactions confirming her worst fears about what the growths might represent. "Have you taken her to the human medical facility?" asked Vera Kothmir, the closest thing New Haven's Altairian community had to an elder. Her voice carried the careful neutrality that Altairians used when discussing topics that challenged social acceptability. "I wanted to consult with our people first," Kira replied, though she was beginning to realize that their people consisted of fewer than 20 adults whose knowledge of Altairian biology had been shaped by cultural traditions rather than scientific understanding. "Perhaps that would be wise," Vera said after a pause that conveyed more meaning than her words. "Human medical science may offer perspectives that our traditional knowledge cannot provide." Kira heard the unspoken message: seek outside help because this is beyond what we understand or are equipped to handle. After ending the conversation, Kira sat in her small living room watching Zara play with toys that were gifts from human neighbors, noting how her daughter moved with the unconscious grace that characterized all Altairian children but seemed somehow different today, as if her developing body was preparing for changes that went beyond normal growth patterns. "Mom," Zara said without looking up from her toys, "are you worried about me?" The directness of the question, delivered with the emotional perceptiveness that made Altairian children impossible to deceive, forced Kira to confront her own fears about what Zara's condition might mean for both of them. "I'm worried about something I don't understand," Kira replied honestly. "The growing feeling on your back isn't something I've seen before, and I want to make sure you're healthy and safe. Do you think the human doctors will know what it is?" Kira looked at her daughter's trusting expression, noting how Zara's luminescence pulsed with curiosity rather than fear, and realized that her 6-year-old was approaching the mystery of her changing body with the kind of open-minded acceptance that adult conditioning had taught Kira to suppress. "I think," she said carefully, "that we need to find someone who can help us understand what's happening to you, even if that means asking questions that are difficult for both of us." As they prepared to visit New Haven's medical facility, Kira found herself fighting cultural conditioning that insisted mutations were shameful secrets to be hidden, while simultaneously recognizing that her daughter's welfare required moving beyond the fear-based responses that had shaped Altairian attitudes toward physical aberrations. The growths on Zara's back were no longer barely visible protrusions but developing structures that pulsed with life and purpose, growing larger and more defined with each passing hour in ways that suggested whatever was happening to her daughter was accelerating beyond anything that could be ignored or denied. Kira held Zara's hand as they left their apartment, aware that they were walking toward answers that might challenge everything she believed about biology, mutation, and what it meant to be Altairian in a universe where their species was learning to survive far from the world that had shaped their understanding of identity and belonging. Whatever was growing on her daughter's back was going to force both of them to discover new ways of understanding what it meant to be themselves. Dr. Sarah Chen's medical facility represented the best that New Haven could offer for frontier healthcare, but Kira felt her anxiety spike as they entered the sterile human environment that smelled of antiseptics and technologies that had never been designed to understand Altairian physiology. The walls displayed medical charts and equipment that might as well have been artifacts from an alien civilization, despite the irony that in this case, Kira was the alien seeking help from the natives. "Mrs. Nethval," Dr. Chen said with the careful pronunciation that indicated she'd been practicing Altairian names since Kira had called to schedule the emergency appointment. "Thank you for bringing Zara in. I understand you're concerned about some unusual growth patterns." Kira watched Dr. Chen's expression as she explained Zara's symptoms, noting how the human physician's professional composure couldn't quite hide her uncertainty about treating a species whose biological processes she had learned only from textbooks and occasional consultations with the refugee community. "May I examine the areas you've described?" Dr. Chen asked gently, addressing the question to Zara rather than her mother in a way that demonstrated respect for the child's autonomy despite her age. Zara nodded with the curiosity that characterized her approach to new experiences, pulling off her shirt to reveal growths that had developed significantly since morning. What had been small protrusions 12 hours earlier had become clearly defined structures emerging from her shoulder blades, appearing almost like the beginning stages of wing formation, though Kira refused to allow that thought to complete itself. Dr. Chen's professional examination involved scanning equipment and careful palpation of the growth areas, her commentary delivered in the technical language that medical professionals used when uncertain about diagnoses but unwilling to admit complete ignorance. "The structures appear to be organic extensions of the skeletal system," she observed, consulting readings from instruments that Kira hoped were providing meaningful information. There's no indication of infection or malignancy, and the growth patterns follow consistent biological architecture rather than random tumor development. What does that mean? Kira asked, though she was beginning to suspect that Dr. Chen's human medical training was as inadequate for understanding Zara's condition as her own cultural knowledge had been. It means that whatever is happening to Zara follows organized biological principles, Dr. Chen replied carefully. The growths aren't random or pathological. They're developing according to some kind of systematic pattern that suggests normal physiological processes rather than disease. Normal for who? Kira asked, her voice carrying the edge of a mother whose fears were not being adequately addressed by clinical language and cautious professional assessments. That, Dr. Chen admitted with honesty that Kira appreciated despite its lack of reassurance, is what we need to determine. I'm not familiar with Altairian developmental biology that might involve post-birth structural adaptations. Are there cultural or biological precedents in your species for this kind of growth pattern? Kira felt the weight of cultural knowledge that had been shaped more by superstition than scientific understanding. There are stories, she said reluctantly. Old warnings about mutations that marked individuals as genetically corrupted. But I always thought they were just cultural myths designed to maintain social purity. Cultural myths often contain biological truths that weren't understood by the societies that created them, Dr. Chen observed thoughtfully. What did these stories suggest about the nature of such mutations? That they represented degradation of Altairian genetic integrity. That individuals who displayed such changes should be isolated from the community to prevent contamination of the species. Kira's voice broke as she voiced fears that had been shaping her responses since discovering Zara's condition. That they were signs of spiritual corruption that marked people as fundamentally flawed. Dr. Chen looked at Zara, who had been listening to this conversation with the careful attention of a child trying to understand adult fears that didn't match her own experience of her changing body. Zara, Dr. Chen said gently, how do you feel about the changes happening to your back? They don't hurt, Zara replied with the directness that made adult anxieties seem unnecessarily complicated. They feel like when my teeth grew in, or when I got taller last year. Like my body is just doing what it's supposed to do. Are you scared of them? No, Zara said, glancing at her mother with confusion about why this required such serious discussion. They're part of me. Why would I be scared of parts of myself? Kira felt something break inside her chest as she realized that her daughter's natural acceptance of her changing body was being undermined by adult fears based on cultural conditioning that might have no basis in biological reality. Dr. Chen, Kira said quietly, what do you recommend? I recommend consultation with a xenobiologist who specializes in adaptive evolution, Dr. Chen replied. Dr. Marcus Webb recently arrived in New Haven to study how refugee populations adapt to new environments. His expertise might provide perspectives that neither my medical training nor traditional Altairian knowledge can offer. A xenobiologist, Kira repeated, aware that she was being asked to entrust her daughter's condition to someone whose understanding of Altairian biology was probably even more limited than Dr. Chen's. Mom, Zara said, tugging on Kira's sleeve with the impatience of a child who had been sitting still for adult conversations too long, can we go home now? I want to show Tommy and Lisa what's growing on my back. They'll think it's cool. The casual way Zara mentioned sharing her condition with human children highlighted the cultural gap between her acceptance of physical change and her mother's shame-based response to anything that deviated from traditional Altairian appearance. Zara, Kira said carefully, maybe we should keep this between us until we understand what's happening better. Why? Zara asked with genuine confusion. It's not a secret. It's just how my body is growing. Dr. Chen watched this exchange with professional interest that suggested she was observing cultural dynamics as much as medical symptoms. Mrs. Nethval, Zara's attitude toward her physical changes is remarkably healthy. Whatever cultural conditioning is driving your concerns, it might be worth considering whether those attitudes serve your daughter's well-being. Kira felt the challenge in Dr. Chen's gentle observation, aware that her fears about mutation and genetic corruption were being questioned by someone whose medical training emphasized adaptation and biological diversity rather than purity and conformity. I just want what's best for her, Kira said, the words carrying all the complexity of a mother whose protective instincts were shaped by cultural traditions that might not apply to their current situation. Then perhaps, Dr. Chen suggested, the best thing is to approach her condition with curiosity rather than fear, and to seek understanding rather than trying to suppress or hide changes that appear to be natural expressions of her biology. As they left the medical facility, Kira found herself caught between maternal protectiveness and growing awareness that her daughter's condition might require expanding her understanding of what it meant to be Altairian in a universe where their species was learning to survive far from the world that had defined their identity. Zara skipped beside her, humming the hybrid melodies that characterized her generation's approach to cultural adaptation, apparently untroubled by adults' complicated fears about the changes that were transforming her body in ways that challenged everything the refugee community thought they understood about genetics, evolution, and the possibilities that exile might create rather than destroy. The growths on Zara's back pulsed with life and purpose as they walked home, developing according to biological principles that neither Altairian tradition nor human medicine had yet learned to understand or appreciate. Dr. Marcus Webb's laboratory occupied the converted cargo bay of what had once been a transport vessel, now serving as New Haven's research facility for studying the biological challenges faced by mixed-species frontier communities. When Kira entered with Zara, she found herself surrounded by specimens, data displays, and monitoring equipment that seemed designed to analyze life forms rather than judge them according to cultural standards of purity or acceptability. Dr. Chen mentioned that you're dealing with some unusual developmental patterns, Webb said, addressing his comments to both Kira and Zara with the kind of scientific curiosity that treated biological diversity as fascinating rather than frightening. I understand there are growth structures that don't match standard Altairian physiology. They're not supposed to exist, Kira said, the words carrying all her cultural conditioning about mutations and genetic aberrations. According to everything I was taught about our species, what's happening to Zara represents biological corruption. Webb looked at Zara, who had been examining his collection of specimens with the fearless curiosity that characterized children who hadn't yet learned to be afraid of biological diversity. Zara, he said gently, would you be comfortable showing me these growth structures? I promise that my examination will be purely observational, no invasive procedures or painful testing. Zara nodded and removed her shirt, revealing growths that had continued developing since their visit to Dr. Chen. The structures emerging from her shoulder blades now clearly resembled the preliminary framework of wing-like appendages, complete with what appeared to be developing joint articulation and muscular attachment points. Webb's reaction was immediate and enthusiastic. Remarkable, he murmured, approaching with the kind of scientific excitement that Kira had never seen directed toward what she'd been taught to view as shameful deformity. The structural development follows consistent evolutionary principles. These aren't random mutations, they're sophisticated adaptive modifications. Adaptive modifications? Kira repeated, uncertain whether Webb's enthusiasm represented good news or simply a different kind of professional concern. Evolutionary responses to environmental conditions that differ from those your species originally evolved to inhabit, Webb explained, his examination revealing details that neither Dr. Chen's medical training nor Kira's cultural knowledge had prepared them to understand. Zara's body appears to be adapting to the specific gravitational and atmospheric conditions of Kepler 438b. Webb moved to his data displays, calling up environmental analyses that compared conditions on Kepler 438b with both Earth and what records suggested about Altair Prime's original environmental parameters. Look at these gravitational differential patterns, he said, indicating charts that meant nothing to Kira but apparently held significance for understanding Zara's condition. Kepler 438b's gravitational field is approximately 15% weaker than Altair Prime's, and the atmospheric density variations in this mountainous region create air currents that would provide significant advantages for organisms capable of powered flight. You're saying that Zara is growing wings because the environment here makes flight advantageous? Kira asked, struggling to process implications that challenged everything she understood about biology, genetics, and the nature of mutation. I'm saying that Zara's biology is demonstrating adaptive flexibility that responds to environmental opportunities in ways that traditional Altairian science apparently never recognized, Webb corrected with growing excitement. These aren't pathological changes, they're evolutionary advantages. Zara had been listening to this conversation with the focused attention she typically reserved for especially interesting discoveries. "Dr. Webb," she said, "does this mean I'm going to be able to fly?" "If the development continues following the patterns I'm observing," Webb replied with scientific honesty that acknowledged uncertainty while affirming possibility, "then yes, you may very well develop functional flight capability." Kira felt the world shift around her as Webb's analysis transformed her understanding of her daughter's condition from genetic corruption to evolutionary advancement. "But how is this possible? Altairians don't fly. We never developed flight capabilities in our original evolution. Species don't develop capabilities until environmental pressures or opportunities make those capabilities advantageous for survival," Webb explained patiently. "Your species may have possessed latent genetic potential for flight adaptation that was never expressed because Altair Prime's conditions didn't require or reward such development." Latent genetic potential. Evolutionary possibilities that exist in a species' DNA but remain dormant until triggered by specific environmental conditions, Webb continued, his explanation revealing depths of biological complexity that Kira had never considered. Many species carry genetic information for adaptations they've never needed to express, but which become activated when they encounter environments that make those adaptations beneficial. Webb returned his attention to Zara's developing wing structures, his examination revealing details that suggested sophisticated biological engineering rather than random mutation. The bone density modifications, the muscular development patterns, the integration with existing skeletal architecture, all of it indicates systematic adaptation guided by genetic information that was already present in Zara's DNA, he observed with admiration for the biological processes he was documenting. "This isn't corruption or degradation. It's evolution in action." "But the cultural teachings about mutations," Kira protested, clinging to familiar frameworks despite their apparent inadequacy for understanding current reality. "The warnings about genetic purity and the dangers of biological aberration. Cultural teachings often reflect limited understanding of biological processes," Webb replied gently but firmly. "What your society may have interpreted as corruption could actually have been early examples of adaptive evolution that were suppressed or eliminated before their benefits could be recognized." Zara had been examining her reflection in one of Webb's polished instrument surfaces, studying the developing wing structures with fascination rather than fear. "Mom," she said, turning to face Kira with luminescence patterns that indicated excitement and hope, "if Dr. Webb is right, then I'm not broken or corrupted. I'm just becoming adapted to our new home." The simple statement carried implications that challenged every assumption Kira had maintained about mutation, genetics, and what it meant to preserve Altairian identity in exile. Webb's scientific analysis suggested that rather than representing loss of their original nature, Zara's changes might indicate her species' capacity to thrive in environments that would have been impossible to inhabit using only their original biological capabilities. "Dr. Webb," Kira said carefully, "if Zara's adaptations continue developing as you predict, what does that mean for her integration with human society? Will she be accepted, or will she be seen as a dangerous aberration?" "From my experience studying mixed-species communities," Webb replied thoughtfully, "human societies tend to be more accepting of biological diversity than many alien cultures. Children, especially, adapt to physical differences with remarkable ease when those differences are presented as natural rather than shameful." "And the other Altairian families in New Haven?" "That," Webb admitted, "may be more challenging. Cultural conditioning about genetic purity can be difficult to overcome, even when presented with scientific evidence that contradicts traditional beliefs." Kira realized that Zara's transformation would require not just biological adaptation but cultural courage, the willingness to embrace change as growth rather than degradation, and to see her daughter's wings not as marks of corruption but as symbols of their species' remarkable capacity to evolve and thrive. "Dr. Webb," she said finally, "will you continue monitoring Zara's development? I think we're going to need someone who understands that what's happening to her is extraordinary rather than shameful." Webb's smile indicated genuine pleasure at the opportunity to document what might be the first recorded example of rapid evolutionary adaptation in refugee populations. "Mrs. Nethval," He replied, "It would be my honor to study the most fascinating example of biological adaptation I've encountered in 20 years of xenobiology research." As they prepared to leave his laboratory, Kira found herself looking at Zara's developing wings not with horror but with growing wonder at what her daughter might become, not despite being Altairian, but because of biological potential that exile had finally allowed to emerge. 3 weeks after Dr. Webb's initial examination, Kira stood in New Haven's Central Plaza watching her daughter prepare for something that challenged every assumption she had ever held about what it meant to be Altairian. Zara's wings had developed into magnificent structures that spanned nearly twice her body width when fully extended, featuring intricate patterns of luminescent tissue that pulsed with the same rhythms as her emotional states. "Are you ready, little star?" Kira asked, using the endearment that had taken on new meaning now that her daughter might literally touch the stars through flight. "I think so," Zara replied, her voice carrying the kind of nervous excitement that accompanied all major childhood milestones, though this particular milestone was unprecedented in recorded Altairian history. "Dr. Webb says the wind currents are perfect today, and my wings feel strong enough." Dar. Webb approached with monitoring equipment designed to document what might be the first recorded flight attempt by an adapted Altairian child. His scientific enthusiasm had been tempered by genuine care for Zara's safety, and his preparations included emergency protocols that Kira hoped would prove unnecessary. "Remember," he told Zara with the gentle authority of someone who had become both researcher and mentor, "start with small hops to test lift capacity. The atmospheric conditions here will feel different from anything your instincts expect, so trust what your wings tell you rather than what your mind thinks should happen." The crowd that had gathered represented the entire mixed-species population of New Haven, drawn by curiosity about whether the refugee child's biological adaptations would prove functional or merely decorative. Kira noted how the human children watched with unconcealed excitement, while the adult humans displayed the kind of supportive interest that characterized their approach to biological diversity. The few other Altairian families present maintained carefully neutral expressions that suggested ongoing uncertainty about whether Zara's changes represented advancement or aberration. "Mom," Zara said, reaching for Kira's hand with the unconscious trust that had characterized their relationship despite the challenges of recent weeks, "are you proud of me?" The question carried weight beyond its simple words, asking not just about flight attempts but about acceptance of changes that had challenged everything Kira thought she understood about her daughter, her species, and the nature of identity itself. "I am proud of your courage," Kira replied with honesty that acknowledged both growth and ongoing struggle. "I am proud of how you've approached changes that frightened me, and I am proud of the grace with which you've helped me understand that my fears were about losing you rather than about anything being wrong with you." Zara's luminescence flared with happiness, her wing structures responding with subtle adjustments that suggested increased readiness for flight attempt. The integration between her emotional state and wing function had become more sophisticated as the adaptations matured, creating feedback systems that impressed Dr. Webb and terrified Kira in equal measure. Beginning initial lift assessment, Webb announced, his documentation protocols serving the dual purpose of scientific record and community reassurance that proper safety measures were being followed. Zara extended her wings fully, the luminescent patterns creating displays that were both beautiful and functional, apparently serving sensory purposes that helped her evaluate air current conditions and optimal positioning for flight attempts. Her first small hop achieved brief hovering that demonstrated genuine lift capacity, while her landing showed the kind of graceful control that suggested instinctive mastery of new capabilities. "Excellent structural integration," Webb observed, his commentary providing technical validation for what everyone could see. Zara's wings were not merely decorative appendages but sophisticated biological tools designed for functional flight. The second attempt achieved sustained hovering at approximately 2 meters altitude, with Zara demonstrating controlled movement and stable positioning that indicated her wing adaptations included not just lift generation but sophisticated flight control capabilities. "She's actually flying," whispered one of the human observers, their wonder carrying the kind of awe that Kira realized she should be feeling instead of the lingering anxiety that still shaped her responses to her daughter's transformation. Zara's third attempt resulted in genuine flight, not just hovering but controlled movement through three-dimensional space, with graceful turns and altitude changes that demonstrated mastery of capabilities that had developed over mere weeks rather than evolutionary millennia. The crowd's reaction was immediate and overwhelmingly positive, with human children cheering and adult humans expressing admiration for biological adaptations that they viewed as remarkable achievements rather than concerning mutations. The other Altairian families' responses were more measured, though Kira detected growing appreciation for capabilities that might represent their species' future rather than departure from their heritage. "Mom, look!" Zara called from her position 15 meters above the plaza, her voice carrying clearly despite the wind currents that supported her flight. "I can see the whole settlement from up here. It's beautiful." Kira looked up at her daughter soaring against the red stone formations that characterized Kepler 438b's landscape, and felt something fundamental shift in her understanding of what it meant to be a mother, an Altairian, and a survivor in a universe that demanded adaptation rather than preservation of original forms. "She's magnificent," said Vera Kothmir, the Altairian elder whose initial reaction to Zara's mutations had reflected traditional cultural conditioning. "I owe you an apology, Kira. What we interpreted as corruption was actually our daughter becoming everything she was meant to be." Dr. Webb's monitoring equipment registered optimal biological function across all parameters, providing scientific validation for what emotional observation had already confirmed. Zara's flight capabilities represented successful adaptation rather than harmful mutation. When Zara finally landed, her movements demonstrated the kind of confident grace that came from mastery of abilities that felt natural rather than learned. Her luminescence pulsed with joy and accomplishment, creating patterns that Kira had never seen but immediately understood as expressions of complete harmony between identity and capability. "How did it feel?" Kira asked, pulling her daughter into an embrace that encompassed wings as well as the familiar contours of the child she had always known. "Like coming home," Zara replied with the directness that made childhood insights profound. "Like my body finally matches who I've always been inside." Dr. Webb approached with data readings that would become part of the scientific record documenting successful evolutionary adaptation in refugee populations, but his expression carried personal satisfaction that went beyond professional achievement. "Mrs. Nethval," he said, "Zara represents proof that your species possesses remarkable biological flexibility. What we've witnessed today suggests that Altairians may be capable of thriving in environments that would have been impossible to inhabit using only original physiological capabilities." Kira looked around the plaza at human neighbors who were congratulating Zara on her flight achievements, at Altairian families whose expressions had shifted from concern to wonder, at her daughter whose wings had become symbols of possibility rather than marks of corruption. "Dr. Webb," she said, "what does this mean for other Altairian children? Will they develop similar adaptations?" "That depends on environmental conditions and individual genetic variation," Webb replied thoughtfully. "Not every child will develop flight capabilities, but your species' capacity for adaptation suggests that exile may not represent loss of identity but evolution toward new forms of Altairian existence." As the crowd gradually dispersed and normal community activities resumed, Kira found herself walking home beside a daughter whose wings folded against her back like elegant cloaks, creating silhouettes that seemed designed for the landscape they now inhabited rather than the world they had lost. "Mom," Zara said as they reached their apartment, "are you still worried about me being different?" Kira considered the question, aware that her answer would shape not just their relationship but her daughter's understanding of what it meant to be herself in a universe that rewarded adaptation over conformity. "I am worried about people who might not understand how wonderful different can be," she replied honestly. "But I am no longer worried about you being different. I am grateful that you are becoming exactly who you were meant to be." That evening, as Kira watched Zara practice controlled hovering in their small courtyard, she reflected on how completely her understanding of motherhood, identity, and survival had been transformed by her daughter's courage to grow wings in a world that had never seen Altairian flight. The child who had once asked why something was growing on her back had become living proof that love sometimes requires letting go of expectations to embrace possibilities that expand rather than diminish what it means to belong to a species that has learned to call multiple worlds home.